A Soviet infantryman fires a 6-foot-long rifle at a German Panther tank. The 14.5mm round slams into 80 millimeters of frontal armor and bounces off harmlessly. The tank is undamaged. The crew is terrified. This happened thousands of times on the Eastern Front, and it reveals something crucial about combat that most people misunderstand. The PTRD-41 anti-tank rifle became obsolete against German heavy armor by 1942, couldn't penetrate a Panther or Tiger from the front, and the Soviets produced over 180,000 of them anyway. German tankers feared it more than weapons that could actually destroy their tanks. Why? Because killing a tank and removing it from battle are two very different things, and the PTRD-41 was a master at the second. Let me show you how a weapon that couldn't penetrate armor became one of the most effective anti-tank weapons of World War II. First, we need to understand what the PTRD-41 actually was. Developed in 1941 as a rush response to the German invasion, it was a simple weapon designed for desperate times. Single-shot, bolt action, 6 feet long, weighed 38 pounds. Fired a massive 14.5 by 114 millimeter cartridge that could blow a fist-sized hole through early war armor. And it worked. In 1941 and early 1942, the PTRD could penetrate German Panzer I, II, and III tanks from reasonable combat distances. 25 millimeters of armor at 500 meters. The early Panzers had armor between 15 and 50 millimeters depending on the angle and location. The PTRD could punch through side armor, rear armor, and in some cases even frontal armor on the lighter tanks. The Soviets loved it because it was cheap and simple to produce. No complex mechanisms, just a massive rifle that fired a massive bullet. Two-man crew could operate it, move it quickly, set up in ambush positions. Production numbers reflected this simplicity. Over 180,000 PTRD-41s were manufactured between 1941 and 1945. Compare that to Germany's Panzerbuchse 39, their anti-tank rifle, which used a much smaller 7.92mm round and was abandoned entirely by 1943 because it became useless. But here's where the story gets interesting. By late 1942 and into 1943, German armor was evolving rapidly. Panthers with 80 millimeters of frontal armor, Tigers with 100 millimeters. Even the upgraded Panzer IVs were getting thicker armor plates. The PTRD-41, designed to fight 1941's tanks, was facing 1943's heavy armor, and it couldn't penetrate. Frontally, the PTRD was useless against a Panther or Tiger. The 14.5mm round would hit that thick armor and bounce off. At best, it would leave a dent and some spalling on the inside, but it wouldn't penetrate. The weapon had become obsolete for its original purpose. Any reasonable military would have stopped production and moved resources to more effective weapons. The Germans did exactly that with their own anti-tank rifles, but the Soviets kept making the PTRD. Production continued even when everyone knew it couldn't kill the tanks it was designed to destroy. Why? Because the Soviets had discovered something. You don't need to penetrate a tank to remove it from combat. You just need to make it useless. And the PTRD-41 was exceptional at making German tanks useless. Let's talk about what a 14.5mm round traveling at 1,000 meters per second can actually do when it hits a tank, even if it doesn't penetrate the main armor. Target number 1, optics and vision devices. Every tank has periscopes, vision ports, rangefinders, and the commander's cupola with viewing slits. These are made of glass and relatively thin armor. A PTRD round hitting a periscope would shatter it completely. Hit the commander's cupola sight, and suddenly the tank commander can't see out. Hit enough vision devices, and the tank is effectively blind. A blind tank is a useless tank. You can't fight what you can't see. You can't navigate, you can't identify targets, you can't avoid obstacles or infantry. German tank crews hit by PTRD fire targeting their optics would often withdraw immediately because continuing to fight blind was suicidal. The tank wasn't destroyed, but it was removed from combat just as effectively as if it had been. Target number 2, tracks and suspension. The PTRD couldn't penetrate the main armor, but tracks aren't armor. They're exposed mechanical components designed to be flexible. A well-placed PTRD round could damage tracks, break road wheels, or destroy drive sprockets, and an immobilized tank is a dead tank, eventually. Soviet doctrine was simple. PTRD teams would target tracks to immobilize German armor. Then infantry would rush forward with grenades, Molotov cocktails, and satchel charges to finish the job. Or they'd just call in artillery on the stationary target. Even if the tank wasn't immediately destroyed, a mobility kill was often permanent. Repair crews would have to come forward under fire to fix the tracks. The tank had to be abandoned or recovered. Either way, it was out of the battle. Target number 3, external equipment. German tanks carried a lot of equipment on their exteriors: antennas for radio communication, externally mounted machine guns, fuel drums and jerry cans strapped to the hull and turret. The PTRD could destroy all of this. Knock out the antenna and the tank loses communication with other tanks in command. Destroy the external fuel supplies and the tank's operational range is cut. Damage the hull machine gun and the tank's defense against infantry is reduced. These might seem like minor inconveniences, but in combat, they accumulated. Target number 5, and this is where the PTRD really shined: lighter vehicles. The German army didn't just use heavy tanks. The majority of their armored vehicles were half-tracks, armored cars, scout vehicles, self-propelled guns with thin armor, and trucks with armor plates. The SDKFZ-251 half-track had maybe 15 millimeters of armor. Armored cars like the SDKFZ-222 had similar protection. The PTRD could punch straight through these vehicles and kill everyone inside. Statistical analysis of PTRD effectiveness shows that the majority of its kills weren't actually main battle tanks. They were lighter armored vehicles, support vehicles, and transport that were absolutely critical to German operations. Destroy enough half-tracks carrying infantry, and the tanks lose their support. Kill enough armored cars conducting reconnaissance, and the Germans lose intelligence on Soviet positions. The PTRD was devastating against the vehicles that made the panzer divisions actually function as combined arms formations. Target number 5, crew exposure. Tank commanders frequently exposed themselves from the cupola for better visibility. Gunners and loaders would sometimes open hatches for ventilation or to reload externally stored ammunition. A PTRD round hitting an exposed crew member was catastrophic. The 14.5 millimeter bullet would kill instantly. German crews learned quickly to stay buttoned up when PTRD teams were active. But staying buttoned up meant reduced situational awareness, which meant reduced combat effectiveness. The mere presence of PTRD fire forced German crews to fight blind and cautious. So, the Soviets adapted their tactics around what the PTRD could actually do, and they got creative. Ambush tactics became standard. Position PTRD teams on the flanks of expected German advances, wait for the tanks to pass, then shoot at the thinner side and rear armor. The rear of a Panther had between 45 and 60 millimeters of armor covering the engine compartment. The PTRD could sometimes penetrate that, especially at close range. Even if it didn't fully penetrate, hitting the engine deck could cause fires, oil leaks, or mechanical damage that forced the tank to withdraw. Urban warfare was where the PTRD became truly deadly. In Stalingrad, Berlin, and other city fights, Soviet teams would position on upper floors of buildings and shoot down onto German tanks. The roof armor on most German tanks was between 15 and 25 millimeters, designed to protect against artillery fragments, not anti-tank rifles firing from above. Shooting down at close range, 50 to 100 meters, the PTRD could penetrate roof armor or, at minimum, destroy optics and external equipment. But the real key was combined arms integration. The PTRD didn't work alone. Soviet doctrine used it as the first layer of anti-tank defense. PTRD teams would engage German armor, targeting optics and tracks. Infantry would rush forward with anti-tank grenades and Molotov cocktails against the blinded, immobilized targets. Artillery would follow up on anything that survived. The PTRD wasn't supposed to kill tanks by itself. It was supposed to disable them long enough for other weapons to finish the job. And there was a psychological component that's often overlooked. The sound of a 14.5 millimeter round hitting a tank was loud and terrifying. The crew inside didn't necessarily know whether the armor had been penetrated or not. They felt the impact. They heard the bang. They might see spalling on the interior. Panic would set in.
Multiple PTRD hits from different directions could convince a crew their tank had been penetrated and was about to brew up. German tanker accounts from the Eastern Front mention the PTRD repeatedly, and the fear is palpable in their descriptions. One account describes the sound of anti-tank rifle hits as terrifying, like someone beating the hull with a sledgehammer. Another mentions losing all vision when our periscopes shattered, turning the tank into a blind metal coffin. A third says, "We preferred artillery fire because at least we knew immediately if we'd been hit seriously. With the anti-tank rifles, every impact made us think we might be penetrated." The fear factor was real. German crews were forced to stay buttoned up more often, reducing their effectiveness. They became more cautious about advancing without infantry support. They avoided areas where PTRD teams were known to operate. The psychological impact of constant PTRD harassment degraded German armored effectiveness beyond what the actual damage statistics would suggest. Let me give you a specific example from the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. Soviet defensive doctrine at Kursk incorporated PTRD teams extensively. They were positioned in prepared positions along the expected German advance routes, particularly on the flanks. As German Panzer formations advanced, PTRD teams would engage from the sides, targeting tracks and optics. They weren't destroying Panthers and Tigers, but they were slowing them down, forcing them to stop and deal with the threat, creating gaps in the German formations that Soviet anti-tank guns and T-34s could exploit. German after-action reports from Kursk mentioned repeatedly the effectiveness of Soviet anti-tank rifle teams in forcing German armor to operate more cautiously and in disrupting the timing of attacks. Now let's talk about why the PTRD stayed relevant when it should have become obsolete. Design advantages mattered. Simplicity was key. Single-shot bolt-action mechanism meant there was almost nothing to break. It worked in mud, worked in snow, worked in the dust and heat of summer. Soviet weapons were designed for Soviet conditions, and the PTRD rarely malfunctioned. Minimal training was required. A soldier could learn to operate it effectively in a few days. Compare that to complex anti-tank guns that required trained crews and extensive practice. Logistics favored the PTRD. It was cheap to produce, maybe 1/10 the cost of a proper anti-tank gun, light enough for a two-man crew to carry and reposition quickly. The 14.5mm ammunition was later standardized for the KPVT heavy machine gun, which meant production infrastructure already existed. And because it was so simple and cheap, the Soviets could make them in massive quantities and distribute them throughout their infantry formations. Availability was perhaps the PTRD's greatest advantage. Every Soviet rifle regiment had a PTRD platoon. The weapon was ubiquitous on the Eastern Front from 1941 to 1945. German forces faced PTRD fire constantly, even in sectors where heavier Soviet anti-tank weapons were present. That constant harassment, that perpetual threat, had a cumulative effect on German operations. Compare this to the German approach. The Panzerbuchs 39 used a 7.92mm round, much smaller than the PTRD's 14.5mm. It was even more obsolete against 1943 armor than the PTRD. Germany's response was to abandon the concept entirely. If it wasn't perfect, replace it with something better. But better weapons took time to develop and were more expensive to produce. The Soviet philosophy was different. Use everything available. A weapon that's good enough and present is better than a perfect weapon that doesn't exist or can't be produced in sufficient quantities. The PTRD was good enough, and there were 180,000 of them. Let's look at the numbers to see if this philosophy actually worked. Statistical impact is harder to measure precisely because Soviet and German record-keeping differed and kill claims are always disputed. But we can piece together the effectiveness from multiple sources. Production versus effect. 180,000 PTRD rifles. Kill claims vary widely, but even conservative estimates suggest thousands of German vehicles were disabled by PTRD fire. Cost effectiveness in terms of disabled vehicles per ruble spent was extremely high compared to expensive dedicated anti-tank guns or the massive resources required to build tanks.
German repair records tell an interesting story. Tank units facing Soviet infantry showed spikes in repairs for damaged optics, replaced vision devices, track repairs, and destroyed external equipment. Many of these were attributed to anti-tank rifle fire. The Germans were spending resources and time repairing damage that didn't destroy the tanks, but removed them from combat temporarily.
And this reveals the paradox that explains why the PTRD worked despite being obsolete. You don't need to kill a tank to win the tactical engagement. You just need to remove it from the battlefield long enough to achieve your objective. A German tank withdrawing to repair its optics isn't supporting the infantry advance. A tank stopped to fix its tracks isn't breaking through Soviet defensive lines. A tank crew buttoned up and blind isn't effectively engaging targets. The legacy of the PTRD-41 extends far beyond World War II. The weapon saw use in Korea, with both sides employing captured or supplied PTRD rifles. North Vietnamese forces used them in Vietnam. Soviet forces in Afghanistan encountered PTRD rifles being used by resistance fighters, ironically turned against their creators. The 14.5mm round itself lives on in the KPVT heavy machine gun, still in service today. The concept of the mobility kill, of targeting components rather than attempting to penetrate main armor, became standard anti-tank tactics. Modern anti-material rifles owe their existence partially to the lesson the PTRD taught. You don't need to kill a vehicle to remove it from combat. The PTRD-41 showed that obsolescence is contextual. A weapon can be obsolete for its original purpose and still be effective if you adapt how you use it. The Soviets couldn't build enough tanks to match German armor quality in 1941 and 1942. They couldn't produce enough anti-tank guns, but they could make simple, cheap anti-tank rifles and distribute them widely. And then they figured out how to make those simple rifles effective even when they couldn't penetrate the armor they were shooting at. This is the real lesson of the PTRD-41. Effectiveness in war isn't just about the specifications of your weapons. It's about doctrine, tactics, and adaptation. It's about using what you have rather than wishing for what you don't. It's about understanding that degrading enemy effectiveness is sometimes more valuable than achieving outright kills. German tankers feared the PTRD not because it could destroy their Panthers and Tigers, but because it could blind them, immobilize them, and force them to fight cautiously when aggression was needed. They feared it because it was everywhere, wielded by enemies who understood how to use it effectively despite its limitations. They feared it because it proved that even obsolete weapons can be deadly in the right hands with the right tactics. And maybe that's the most important takeaway. In war, the winner isn't always who has the best equipment. Sometimes it's who best understands how to use what they have. The PTRD-41 couldn't penetrate heavy armor, but it didn't need to. It just needed to remove German tanks from combat long enough for the Red Army to win, and by that measure, it succeeded brilliantly.